Hey there, CPO here, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about these upgraded Taro branded blade grips with the thrust bearings. This is an upgrade from what comes with the kit, and so I want to talk a little bit about these, mostly because they're a fairly simple replacement, but getting them apart and back together has been a little bit challenging for some folks, myself included, I'll admit. Just because the tolerances are so tight and the parts are so small. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about it and how to disassemble and then reassemble these. So just like on any other bearing assembly or even thrust bearing assembly like the main rotor grips, you want to make sure you disassemble these first. Make sure that everything is properly lubed and thread locked before you put it back together. They come to you, looking like they're ready to go, and I think a lot of people have a tendency to just bolt them on and run with them, which would be not the right approach because you don't have the right lubrication in there. So I'm just going to take these things apart. If you have a vise, this could be a really helpful little tool, and I just have this little vise, that I could use to clamp one end in here, let me give it a little bit of an angle for you so you can see things at a different angle. So the first thing I want to do is take off these blade grip screws here. And then within here is the screw that holds the entire assembly together. It should come off fairly easy. One thing I found is if you take the 3mm driver, you can slip it right where the slider shaft would normally go. Same dimensions. Will allow you to hold everything in place. Makes it easy. I'm just applying a little bit of resistance there where in my case, because I'm using a vise, I could actually do something like that to lock that into place. But basically all I want to do is pull this out, get that screw out of the way there. Now that you have the screw out, what you'll find is these things don't just pop off. They're pretty snug, and that's been kind of the challenge for a lot of people, is the fact that these things are in there pretty darn tight. So there's lots of recommendations on how to get this out. A lot of people will suggest throwing them in the oven, 250, 300 degrees, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, kind of loosen things up, or hit it with a heat gun. Point being is that the reason that supposedly works is because the aluminum, like blade grip for example, will heat up and expand at a different rate than the steel will, which is in the bearings. So if the steel bearings are locked against the aluminum, it gives a chance for the aluminum to kind of expand a little bit. You can try that. Here's a little trick that I found, which basically, now that I have the screw out, right, my retaining screw, I'm going to put this blade screw back in. And then use my blue driver, which this is the 2.5mm driver. It fits through there fairly nicely. And then with that, and then using this bottom one as leverage, basically what I found is I can kind of work it and wiggle it. Using this as a fulcrum. If you run into some problems with this, feel free to hit it with some heat. I'm actually going to take this out of the vise for a second so that sometimes the best view for you isn't the easiest position for me to work on. I'm just going to hold this down and work it, and then it pulls it right out. So you can see there what I have. Basically, I was able to get it separated, and then I'll show you kind of how this works. But the reality of it is, what I found is it's not necessarily the aluminum blade grip that is hanging things up on my assemblies. It's generally the bearing. Let me take out this. It's the outside bearing. This one right here. I don't know if you can see that. This bearing right here gets hung up on this shaft, and that's where all of my pressure comes from in my assembly. So at any rate, so that's how one side comes off, and then you know, you've got one larger bearing, and I'll show you how all this stuff goes back together. But you've got the one larger inside bearing, and then you've got some stuff in here. So we can't forget about this stuff. So what's in here is your thrust bearing assembly. There's another outside bearing, and there's a little shim in there. That top bearing, the outside bearing, comes out pretty easy. And that is this guy here, a little smaller, and then there's a shim that sits underneath it. Don't lose it. And then now what I have in here is my thrust bearing assembly. So if you can see anything in there, you've got more work to do. So don't think that pulling these two bearings out is going to be a completed removal. So now we've got to get this out of here. You can do a couple things. You can try and kind of push them through. I'll show you a little neat trick that I came up with. It seems to work for me, and that is to take the 2.5mm driver and just basically get some black tape wrapped around it, almost kind of a cone shape, to where it gets it's skinny at the tip and gets fatter as you go. And then I push it in through the bottom, kind of give it something to work on, and then push. And as you can see, that begins to push out this bearing assembly. The tape kind of grips it from the inside and gives it something to grab onto, and then just as you push it through, it'll work its way out. So that's how I chose to get them out. There's a lot of different ways to do things, so you know, if you find a method or you already know of a method that works for you, use it. And then what you have here is the two races, and then the center you know, ball bearings. So, and I'll show you more about that later here in a second. So now when we look in here, you can see it's completely clean. There's no metal. You just see the black aluminum. That means you've got everything out of there. So in the end, let's take a look at our parts here in no particular order just yet. So we've got our blade grip, we've got a shim, we've got an inner and outer radius bearing, and then you have your thrust bearing assembly. And then of course, you know, you've got the shaft that all that is going to slide onto. Now I'll go ahead and do the same thing to this other one. Pull that out so that I can remove this screw and washer. Now again, if you need to, you can slip your driver through there, your 3mm driver, and use it to hold everything together and keep it from turning. Okay, and then once I have that screw out, I put this blade screw back in and then use it to pry up. That one came off a lot easier. I'm done with that. So now, same thing. I've got to, figure out how to get the bearings out of here. I've got this one bearing. Comes off pretty easy. I'm just going to set that on this side, so I've got a couple different sides here. That'll be in the middle. And then usually I can kind of work out that top bearing either by shaking it or pushing it through with the driver. And then don't forget about this little shim that's going to fall out with it. And then again, actually this thrust bearing assembly comes out pretty easily. At least 2/3 of it did. I got one more, and just like we did on the other one, just use that to push that last thrust bearing race out. So that works really well. I like it anyway. There are probably many different ways to do that. And then now if we look in here, you can see it's all cleaned out. I've got all the bearings and races out of there. So that's what you're looking for. Like I said, if you see any metal, any shiny metal, you've got more stuff to come out. So don't quit too soon. Let's take a look at our parts here. So you have your two grips. You have your center shaft here. You've got a larger inner diameter and outer diameter bearing, for that matter, that goes on either side. There's a skinnier bearing, smaller bearing, that will go on the outside of the blade grip, like that. Within that, you'll have your thrust bearing assembly. And I'll show you how all this goes together here. And your shims. So that's pretty much all the parts now from either side. And so let's explore in a little bit more detail the order of how this works, and then in particular this thrust bearing, which will be obviously important to make sure we have right. So what I chose to do before assembly is to clean everything. I use a carburetor or parts cleaner. And when I say clean everything, I wipe down these bearings, but I don't actually do anything with them. I don't lube them, and because of that, I don't put them in parts cleaner or anything like that, because there's probably some lubricant inside of there from the factory. But these sealed bearings, I'm of the opinion to just leave them alone. All the other metal parts, however, I do clean down and get rid of all the grease and machine oil and all that. So, but with these thrust bearings, basically it's a three-part deal, and I covered this a little bit on the head, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail to make sure we fully understand not only what order, but give you some perspective that will apply every time you pull anything apart with a thrust bearing. So you've got an inner race, an outer race, and a ball bearing set here. And it's probably hard to tell from here, but the inner race and the outer race have very different inner diameters. And when I say very different, I mean different enough to be important, but subtle given the small size. So let's pop a measurement. So this is looks to be like a 3.16. And then let's see what the other one turns out to be. 3.08. So this one on the left is a larger inner diameter, and this one on the right is a smaller inner diameter. That's important to know. You've got to be able to figure out which one is smaller and which one is larger. If you can't eyeball it, make sure you measure it. If you don't have a little micrometer like this, which makes it really easy, then you can use a ruler or something to figure out. There's also the method of putting them onto a shaft or some sort of assembly and seeing which one has the most play. So the one with the most play is the larger, but I just prefer to measure. Although actually I can fairly well eyeball, even though that's just a few hundredths of a millimeter difference, I can tell looking at it that this one is bigger than this one. So maybe that's the case for you as well. So with regard to the assembly, the larger inner diameter is always on the side towards the center of whatever you're rotating against. So in this case, the larger one would go in, and then you have these little ball bearing cups. Now, this is another one of those debatable topics. Generally, it doesn't matter which direction this goes. Some manuals will show it with the cup facing out. Some manuals will show it with the cup facing in. I think the general consensus is most people prefer to put the cup facing in towards the center of the assembly, so that the grease that you use to lubricate these will maintain a little bit better against centrifugal force. So I would put it cup like that, cup down, and then the outer is the smaller inner diameter, and that will go like that. And what you want to make sure, so you have your little bearing assembly here, and you just want to make sure that the grooves are facing in against the ball bearings. So you see you've got these little the groove side, and then the flat side. So just remember, groove side goes in, it kind of makes a sandwich with the bearings in the middle. And actually this will be, let me just show you how this whole assembly goes together anyway, without the blade grips. So you've got your shaft assembly. The larger bearing will slip on, and that'll go there. Then next you're going to put your blade grip through, but we're going to skip that for now to show you what it looks like on the inside. So imagine there's a blade grip. Whoops, I lost my... So you've got the bearing, and then as we talked about, the larger inner diameter will go first with the grooves facing out. Then the ball bearing assembly will go in next with the groove or the cup facing in. And then the outer race will go in with the groove facing in. And basically that's what that's going to look like inside. Now you can see there's a gap here between the regular radial bearing and the thrust bearing, and that's where your blade grip is gonna fit in there. And the next thing we're gonna have is a shim. Which is gonna go there. And then you're gonna have your other bearing. And in my opinion, the bearings are a snug fit onto that shaft, and that's probably what is giving most of the grief for people who are having trouble getting these things apart. So you might try flipping them and rotating them. If they give you grief one way, they may slip on easier the other way. So that is that. That's basically in a nutshell what the bearing assembly is going to look like. And of course, you'll button that down with this screw and washer. So hopefully that helps you give a picture of what's happening on the inside of these blade grips. And again, don't forget this grip is going to rest right inside, and will mount in between this section here. So the next thing I want to do is lubricate and grease the thrust bearing, and then reassemble everything. So let's do that now. Alright, so basically I'm just taking a little bit of grease. This is some general purpose grease. And basically I'm just rolling these around in it. Doesn't take a whole lot. That's got them all nice and lubed up. Hopefully you can see that. And then with that said, set these aside. Alright, So I have my shaft clamped in the vise just to kind of give me some extra hands here. I have these rubber protectors here to keep them safe, and it's not in there too tight. And basically, this larger bearing will slip over that shaft. Then I need the blade grip. I'm going to make sure there's no gunk in there. And that will slip right over the top, just like that. So next I need my large inner diameter race, which is this guy here. And I'm going to take my ball bearings, basically rest it on top of that, and then take my smaller inner diameter race and put it on there. So one thing I like to do, I like to get everything lined up on a driver. Kind of helps me a little bit. Make sure everything gets seated, and you can stick the driver through and then slide that in. Again, making sure you know which one is larger and which one is smaller. So if you have any questions, double check, because that's critical. Once you have that, you can slip those down in there. And they should slip right over that shaft. You can kind of work them down like that. There we go. That's a little better view for you. Now, one thing you can do here, and I even recommend it, is take your blade grip bolt here with the washer, and go ahead and feel like you need to go ahead and screw it through if you're having a hard time getting those thrust bearings to seat down. Eventually you're going to get to a point where you need some assistance, otherwise it's going to turn on you. In which case, remembering that I could use that, and I can also use it in combination with that, and that'll tighten it down. So you don't need to make it tight, just it'll help you kind of press things in. When you pull it apart though, make sure you get your washer out of there too. There we go. All right, so I've got the thrust bearing set in there, lubricated. The next thing I need is my little shim. That's going to go right inside there. I like to align it a little bit with the driver. And then it helps me to slip the bearing just like before on the driver, and then use that as a guide, and that should let it slide right into place. Now if I put this driver through the grip sideways, I can kind of push and press this down into there. There we go. Now I've got that pressed in there nicely. You just want a little thread locker on the thread, and then I would even argue to wipe off any excess, because you don't want that oozing out into that bearing. And then try your best to stab it through without getting any on the bearing assembly. Okay, I'll flip this over. The same thing to the other side. First my larger bearing. Then my blade grip. Then I look for the larger inner diameter race and make my little bearing sandwich with my lubed up ball bearings. So there's my bearing sandwich right here. Those fit nice and down inside there. And the shim. Then this outside bearing. There we go. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of finagling to get it to work in there. Now I'm going to thread lock it. And it'll take a little bit of tightening to get everything completely pressed in. So if it feels like it's like never-endingly not getting tight, just keep spinning because it's working its way down. It will get tight. Okay, so that is now a completed lubed and ready to go thrust bearing blade grip assembly. So hope that was helpful for you. I needed something to do today while I wait for the mailman to bring me some more parts. I believe I have a 500 kit coming in the mail today, so I'm kind of excited, but I wanted to knock this out really quick because I know it's been kind of a hot topic. So at any rate, appreciate it. Thanks for watching.